Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter solicitors, and this is the second in our series of podcasts for Module 2 of the COVID Inquiry. As usual, I'm joined by Lorelei King on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, and she will be putting questions to our panel. So joining me on the panel is Pete Weatherby KC, our lead barrister for the UK legal team. Mary-Claire McDermott, who is one of the barristers for our colleagues in the Northern Ireland team. Barbara Herbert, who is the lead of the Welsh branch of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. And finally, Fazilet Hadi, who is head of policy at Disability Rights UK.
Fazilet, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such an interesting week at the inquiry with a lot of testimony about structural inequality. On Monday, we had testimony from Cameron Malik, the CEO of Disability Rights UK, the organization you belong to. Mr. Malik said that you're a disabled people's organization, which is different from disability charities. Can you tell us a little bit about the organization and what that difference is?
Yes, thank you. I'd love to. So a disabled people's organisation is an organisation which is really run by and led by disabled people. So often we find that the bigger disability charities are really led by non-disabled people. You know, often we find the CEO, the leadership team can be full of non-disabled people. But with a disabled persons organisation, the majority of our trustees are disabled people, majority of our staff. And I suppose that makes us a little different because not only do we have our professional roles and our expertise, but we have lived experience and we experience the things that we're talking about often. And at Disability Rights UK, we're what's called a pan-disability organisation. So we kind of try and think about what affects disabled people with different impairments, different long-term health conditions, and then think about the social model, which is what are the barriers that society puts in our way. So as well as being led by disabled people, we often look at the world through a social model lens. So we don't focus too much on the health condition or the impairment, but much more on how does society need to change? How do policies need to change? How do attitudes need to change?
Thank you. And from what you've said, I imagine that must feel quite empowering, both to you and to your members.
Definitely, because, you know, so often as disabled people speak over our heads or, you know, to the person with us, or can be quite patronising. And so actually talking about our own truth and talking truth to power and, you know, having our voices in the room makes a real difference. And it feels like, as you say, empowering, but also like we are equal citizens and it feels like we're taking our place as equal citizens.
Mr. Malik made a really interesting point about how the interests of disabled people would be better served by having a minister whose remit was cross-governmental and not just with the Department of Work and Pensions, which I think is the way it is now.
Yes, so even though the Minister for Disabled People, you know, that's quite a grand title, isn't it? And but Cameron rightly pointed out that minister is within the Department for Work and Pensions. And I think Cameron gave examples that if you go to the minister and say, I've got issues with social care or housing or transport, they then just direct you to another minister. They act like a kind of signposting service. And I think what Cameron was saying was that actually we need a minister to be much, much more senior within government, maybe sitting at the cabinet table, not just kind of acting as a post box, but actually taking an active role in making sure government policies are joined up, that the 20% of the population who are disabled people are truly thought about at the outset of decision making. And I think, we've seen from the evidence given by the Minister for Disabled People, that actually it's pretty weak, given what we were experiencing as a community from pretty much day one of the pandemic. His involvement was pitifully, woefully inadequate. Cameron was asking for more seniority, more clout, more overview, more co-production with disabled people. So having us talking about these issues at the outset before the policies are made, so that, the policies are made with our input, and just really overhauling the government policy making machine and the minister to really, make sure that disabled people are represented within government and actions are taken that include us.
Fazilet, the fact that this evidence has been heard, is this not just another example of why it's so important to have structural inequalities included in this inquiry?
Oh, do you know what? I'm so proud of all the groups that really campaigned for systemic structural inequalities to be part of the inquiry. It's so often, we know about the inequalities and we sometimes feel like we're talking to ourselves or preaching to the converted. And it is really heartening to see a major establishment inquiry really, I think, paying quite a lot of regard to structural inequalities. And certainly that felt like it through the pre-pandemic planning module, and it feels like it through this module. Obviously, it's not all about just the evidence. We'll have to see what the recommendations are, but it's really, really good to have these issues talked about by the inquiry team, barristers, asking probing questions, the chair, Heather Hallett, taking a real interest. It feels really, really positive. And as I say, so often it feels like we're just talking in a little bubble on our own somewhere. But this feels more like a national stage. And so, I really hope that the evidence everyone is giving on systemic inequalities, I hope it really does make that difference we want it to make for the future.
I absolutely agree that it's so important to have this evidence on structural inequalities included. It was clear from the evidence of Professors Shakespeare and Watson that disabled people were an afterthought in many of the pandemic provisions and excluded from measures that were taken to protect the general population. And what we didn't want to see was those same people being an afterthought in this inquiry. So we are pleased that the evidence is coming out and hopefully being heard by the people who have the power to make the changes that are so clearly needed.
Absolutely. And, when I listened to the evidence from Tom Shakespeare and Nick Watson on sort of disability inequality, it struck me that so many of the issues were documented, they were known about. There was no excuse, for not thinking about disabled people in pre-pandemic planning and in the planning during the pandemic. It was all so well documented, our exclusion, our poverty, our digital exclusion, our inaccessible homes, our challenges with employment, our challenges in accessing services. None of this was new. It's actually been around a long, long time. And for the government to kind of absolutely have no regard to it, which is actually what is coming out in evidence, almost worse than no regard, a disregard, is absolutely outrageous. And I suppose that is hard to hear, that they cared so little for 20% of the population.
Earlier in that day, we heard testimony from Professors Shakespeare and Watson, who talked about the disproportionate impact the NPIs had on disabled people. the non-pharmaceutical interventions. I found this testimony really enlightening. The example they used was, how would a guide dog understand what is necessary in terms of social distancing? Fazilet, can you talk a little about how you and the people you represent found the pandemic, especially in terms of those restrictions?
Yeah, so disabled people have many, many different impairments and health conditions and different levels of income, although we're disproportionately poorer than the rest of the population. Obviously, you can be disabled at any age. So, around 42% of older people are disabled people, around 21% of working age adults, and around 8% of children. So obviously the experiences are going to differ hugely, but there were some real consistencies that people who were getting social care at home, their needs weren't really thought about. So they're very, very anxious about, what do I do? Because my carer doesn't have the PPE, my carer isn't being tested, but I need care and support in the home. In residential homes, we know that not only were there those issues, but the issues of people with COVID being moved in to homes. And I think the professors remarked on how in what they called a congregate setting, a setting where there's a group of people, obviously a virus is going to get around that group very quickly. For people who struggled with getting, doing the shopping, a lot of us found ourselves not being able to go to the supermarket because we couldn't socially distance. But then the supermarkets prioritised people who are clinically extremely vulnerable, and a lot of people who had online deliveries, whether that was because of mobility issues or sensory issues, they found those slots just gone and found themselves without being able to access food. I mean, that's truly incredible that was allowed to happen, and no thought was given to the reasonable adjustments that needed to be put in place in regulations. So disabled people were told you can only exercise once a day, and disabled people and families with disabled children spoke out and said, hold on a minute, there's no way my disabled child can just exercise once a day, for various reasons. They need to be out much more than that. And then the government belatedly said, okay, if you've got it in your education, health and care plan that you need activity, you can then exercise more than once a day. On face coverings, people who legitimately couldn't wear face coverings because of an impairment or a mental health issue or a physical condition, the government did put in reasonable adjustments saying that disabled people who legitimately couldn't use a face covering would be exempt, but they didn't really communicate that. They said face coverings were mandatory. So then disabled people on buses, in shops, had to put up with hostility and harassment because people thought they were breaking the rules. So there's just so many things hitting people. People, I haven't even mentioned one of the most horrible things, which is disabled people worried that they'd have a do not attempt resuscitation notice put on their file, so that if they were in hospital, they wouldn't be resuscitated. And other disabled people feeling that they were the last in the queue for critical care and that our lives weren't valued equally. So a whole range of issues, and people are probably still living with some of the scars of those issues.
And finally, can I ask what outcomes you would like to see from this inquiry?
Well, I think that's a really, really important question, because obviously it's vital that we share the evidence and the lived experience. But in terms of recommendations, I'd echo some of the points that Cameron made in his evidence. We'd really like to see governments having to co-produce policies with disabled people at the outset, and have us round the table when they're thinking about policies and plans, not when they've made them already and then they don't meet our needs. So definitely more more engagement, but more joint decision making, more collaborative decision making. It's not good enough that civil servants are in an ivory tower and then they just present us with their best work. Better government machinery, including a much more senior Minister for Disabled People, and much more joined up thinking across government departments about what a good society looks like for disabled people, rather than everything being done in silos. I think that could be really important. Better funding for disabled people's organisations so that we can advocate for disabled people and join those conversations about policy making. I think that's all really, really important. And I think communication as well, much better communication, from government to disabled people, using all accessible forms of communication, easy read, BSL, audio, Braille, whatever people need, and not solely relying on digital to get the message out. And better monitoring, better evidence around disabled people. As I said earlier, I do think that there's a lot of evidence already out there, but I think the government needs to get a lot better, probably at not just collecting the evidence, but acting on it.
I absolutely agree. The evidence we've heard has been eye-opening for me, but that's just a matter of everyday life for the people you represent. But it's demonstrated a real need for wholesale change. And we're not just talking about plans for the next pandemic here and making sure that includes a plan for the needs of disabled people and how their needs will be met. But we need to look deeper at how we build our cities and our buildings and our infrastructure and our communications so that everything is accessible to all.
Totally agree. And, if you can make it accessible to disabled people, you'll make a better society for everyone.
Yes, thank you so much for talking to us, Fazilet.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
To our listeners, if you want to know more about the organization, their website is disabilityrightsuk.org. Nicola, it was great talking to Fazilet about disabilities and inequalities. And on the same day they took testimony from Karen Malik, they also took testimony from Professor Henderson, who is an expert on devolution. And they were talking about how decisions are made in Westminster and the devolved nations. Mary Claire, what did you make of her testimonies?
So in terms of Henderson, she was a key witness for the devolved nations. She really exposed and highlighted that there were various committees and bodies established already that could have been employed and effectively were not employed, or if they were, not put to good use. And she established from the outset that the real way of working with devolved administrations is to have a good level of communication, early communication and sharing of information and data. But unfortunately, what happened is that those structures that were in place were not sufficient to withstand the crisis that unfolded. So what she has done is outlined the problems within the intergovernmental structures and highlighted effectively the problems of not being so England-centric, so being focused on England in terms of data, focused in England in terms of funding, and then trying to apply a one-size-fits-all to the devolved administrations. And then we had an examination of the material that was available. So in terms of the internal workings and emails between and letters from the outset from the devolved administration going to the government saying, we need to have a voice at the table. There's no point having a seat at the table if you don't have a voice. And then you have the internal workings of, for example, the email with Michael Gove, who quite poignantly referred to the Trojan horse, effectively saying that the devolved administrations were this Trojan horse and made the government workings and considerations a bit more vulnerable because they were at the table and how we manage them. And effectively what she has done has set a very clear course and framework as to what ought to have happened and didn't happen, and the state and lack of communications between the bodies that were. and underlines the argument that we've made time and time again in this inquiry, that Northern Ireland sometimes was not invited to the consideration and information sharing. And when it was, it didn't have an opportunity to speak. And so it really exposed the UK government decision making in terms of who was listening to what we had to say. So she was a big witness, and that's played out as we've seen the other witnesses during this week in terms of what policy and modelling had been in place. And we heard today from Professor Medley, who said that there was no modelling for Northern Ireland. If there was, I didn't know anything about it. So she's a crucial and significant witness this week for us.
I remember she mentioned that she was quite shocked by that Federalist Trojan horse comment.
Yeah.
I think she said she'd never seen anything like it.
Precisely. In all her years, that was the phrase that jumped out. And why would you say it? That, her specialism is a professor of political science. And to see something as striking as that is really quite jaw-dropping, to be perfectly honest with you. So she was a crucial and pretty incredible witness. We were pretty keen to lean into that evidence, and it was in keeping with the lines of inquiry that we wanted the inquiry to consider.
I wonder if I could ask Pete. We're in Module 2 now, and we have Modules 2A, B, and C coming up, which is about decision-making in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, in that order. I know you've been keen for COVID Bereaved Families UK to be core participants in those modules. Why is that important, and what's kind of happening there?
It's important to the families because the UK group from the outset has organised on a whole UK basis, because constitutionally we have a UK and a UK government. But equally, right from the outset, that we very much encourage the families to organise in the devolved branches as well. What then subsequently happened, as I think we all know, is that some Scottish and some Welsh families decided that they wanted to be autonomous and left the group. And so they're separately represented. And so we have sought simply to get core participant status in each of the modules. Now, bearing in mind that we represent currently 194 Welsh families and 218 Scottish families, that it's very, very important to them in an area where obviously they have all of those families have interests in the UK inquiry and the UK issues, but they also have very important issues locally in their devolved nations or jurisdictions. Now, with the way that we're working with the Northern Ireland team has primacy in devolved issues and work with us on UK issues. So that relationship works well. But we were very surprised not to be given CP status in modules 2A, B, and C. CP status, core participant status, means that the families and the family's legal team, first of all, get disclosure of the evidence. Secondly, have representation rights in the hearings. And so we make submissions and suggest questions and hopefully ask some questions and take a full part in opening and closing submissions. So it's really rather important. We were surprised not to be given full participant status in A, B, and C. Recently, the chair has made two decisions which caused us to revisit that. So she indicated that she was not going to call devolved witnesses in Module 2 itself. The second issue was that she's going to do one report for Module 2, Module 2A, 2B, and 2C. Now, that's not a bad idea, but it's very difficult for us and the families that we represent if we're not at the table, if you like, in A, B, and C. So we asked her to reconsider her position, and we made crystal clear that, frankly, the large number of families that we represent in Wales and Scotland, and the importance to everybody, all of the families, of us being involved in those modules, and unfortunately the chair has exercised her discretion again not to give core participant status. Now I know, because obviously I've talked to lots of families throughout, just how upset many families will be about that. I'm sorry that the chair has come to that decision, but that's the way it is, and we're just going to have to crack on with it. At the moment, it's the only module where this has been raised, that they're going to be sub-modules. I'm not entirely sure why the chair has picked module 2 to do this. It doesn't appear that she's going to do it in any other module. So although it is obviously problematic at the moment, we are talking about 2 sets of hearings, one in Wales and one in Scotland, early next year, which I think each of them are going to be about 12 days. So although it is obviously concerning to the families and the difficulty, it's not the end of the world. And then, although we are formally excluded from the Northern Ireland one as well, the relationship with the Northern Ireland team means that's an irritation rather than a problem.
Thank you. And Barb Herbert is there, who, as you said, is the lead on the COVID bereaved families, the Wales branch. Barb, what are your thoughts about this exclusion?
It's obviously very disappointing. I had a bit of a meltdown when I heard. And all we can do is run with it. We just have to find a way through. A couple of things that were in the note from Baroness Hallett was that we are welcome to send witness statements into her. So she wants us to do the job, but we're not allowed to participate, which seems a bit strange to all concerned. And there was another issue, but I won't mention that one on this, because it's a lot of contention about it has already happened. So but it's mainly that we are welcome to put in witness statements and offer lived experiences in Wales. We actually can't participate, which is quite strange. But you come up with that.
This is me being, I'm sure, thick. I don't. Who Pete will be representing Wales? They have different lawyers. Is that how it works?
Well, a group of families decided to leave the COVID bereaved Families for Justice and set up their own Welsh organisation, and same in Scotland. So there is a separately represented group. So Baroness Hallett has given them core participant status. Now, I've made it crystal clear that it's not for us to tell people who they should be represented by or which group they should belong to. So we're in no way, and we've made it very clear on the face of our application, that we're not trying to knock them out, if you like. And there, many times in inquests or inquiries, you do get different groups of bereaved families who have separate representation. So it's by no means unusual to do that. And we make crystal clear that we're not suggesting that any bereaved family is more important or has any more rights to anybody else. But the corollary of that is that the fact that Baroness Hallett has given full participant status to this, to the breakaway group, is that shouldn't oust the approximately 200 families in Wales and 200 families in Scotland who are part of the main COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group.
I understand. And it looks like there will be no movement on that from what you and Barb were just saying.
I mean, and as I say, I'm not trying to minimise it, because I do think I know it's been a very distressing issue for families in the group from Wales and Scotland, and more generally, of course. But I do think that we need to move on from it, and I don't think it's going to happen in any other module. So I'm not trying to minimise it, but it's not going to get in the way more than is obvious.
Yeah, I think it's this week. Just moving on to a different topic, I think the two big themes this week were trust, or the breaking thereof, and data. Data seemed really big this week, the insufficiency of it and how the inability to share it harms us. There was one, since you're there, Pete, I'll ask you, there was one particular thing that I was so glad. I think they were interviewing Professor Sir Ian Diamond from the ONS.
Yeah.
I didn't know statistics could be as interesting as he made them, but there it was. And he referred to a letter that someone had written to, Sir David Norgrove had written to Matt Hancock about the way that.
Okay, let me explain. Professor Diamond is the national statistician and the chief executive of the UK Statistics Authority, and the head of the Office for National Statistics. So the producers, if you like, of statistics and data, which were then used. And you're right that he highlighted the very poor level of available data, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, and all the problems associated with that. And he then went on to say that they did a good job in turning that round, which, you know, may well be the case. But in the course of it, he was taken to a letter by the chair of the UK Statistics Authority. So he was the chief executive, but the chair wrote or corresponded with Matt Hancock, and it's all on the UK Statistical Authority's website. And Sir David Norgrove basically called Matt Hancock out for misrepresenting the testing figures. So families will no doubt remember that Hancock was daily on television saying how much they were ramping up the testing capacity in April and May of 2020. And the reality is that they had completely failed to scale up testing, and there was a massive shortage of testing. So it was a really major part of the problem. So not only had they had this pretty catastrophic failure to ramp up the capacity, but then it's quite clear that the UK Statistical Authority thought that Matt Hancock was cooking the books in terms of the figures that he was publicly stating. And he was conflating or aggregating two different figures. And so that's what the correspondence was about. It was really quite an interesting point, and it's a point that we'll be taking up. Now we've taken it up with the Statistics Authority. We'll be taking it up with Matt Hancock.
I'm glad to hear that. Like I said, I was just really glad that when you had your opportunity to question him, you pointed up the word misleading. Yeah. And the witness was forced to say, yes, that is what he meant, misleading. So I was really glad about that. This was like one of my top witnesses this week was Professor Tom Hale, who's an expert on stringency of NPIs, which are non-pharmaceutical interventions. He was just fascinating, and how he talked about, I didn't really realize about how if those NPIs are implemented early enough, they can prevent really stringent lockdowns.
Yeah, I agree. Very interesting. And I would add to that Sir Mark Walport, who came after him, who was equally compelling on the similar frame. And that's something we've been punting on behalf of the families right the way through, that it wasn't just the dither and indecision and lack of leadership which led to late NPIs, and then most regrettably, obviously far more people died because of that indecision and dither. But it was that the alternative, if you had taken the NPIs earlier, non-pharmaceutical interventions, lockdowns or other social distancing measures, border controls, et cetera, if you'd taken a suite of those measures earlier and in a more stringent way, then they would have lasted less long, because the actual cutting the reproduction rate, the infection rate, would then have meant that they could have been lifted earlier. Now, of course, there were various waves, so it may well have been that there would have then been the necessity, as there was in any event, for a second or a third imposition of NPIs. But again, they would have been for a shorter period. And there are lots of people who are less affected by the pandemic generally, who are saying, well, why do we need to have a lockdown anyway? It didn't achieve much and it wrecked the economy. Well, obviously, I don't agree with that, and none of the families will agree with that. But even if you gave that house room an earlier, harsher lockdown or quarantine for travellers or compulsory mask wearing on buses, would earlier and harder would have been shorter, and shorter means education wouldn't have been affected as much, the economy wouldn't have been affected as much, and of course there wouldn't have been as many fatalities.
I think Hale in particular, he talked about this ramping up and ramping down roller coaster thing, and I think we suffered from that because England really did that. And these peaks and troughs in the infection rate, he thought were caused by imposing later lockdowns and then rescinding. One thing that really stood out to me, and I'm actually referring back a little bit to Monday and to the Inquiry Council, what he's saying, when you contrast what Ms. Cecil from the Inquiry, she said, I hadn't realized this, that while Eat Out to Help Out was going on, there were women giving birth who could not have their partners with them.
Yeah.
This was information she was reporting on some surveys that came through. Yeah. And I thought, well, there's the roller coaster in action.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's pleasing. You mentioned the witnesses, but it's actually pleasing that some of the counsel to the inquiry, as you said, Ms. Cecil, but also Mr. Keith this week, have actually been taking the points that we've highlighted, this kind of point. So their questioning of the witnesses has been quite instructive to me as well, which is it's quite pleasing that they've understood the points, or they've come to the same points independently. And the Eat Out to Help Out is a particularly good example, because you have a lockdown where you are requiring people to stand apart from each other and not assemble, even families assembling together. And then you give them money to do the opposite and go to an enclosed space and you subsidize the opposite of what you've just done. And the problem with that, obviously, I mean, it's completely obvious and it should have been obvious to everybody, is that you just undo the good work that you've done in the first place by having a lockdown. And that's, you know, the tragedy, of course, of Eat Out to Help Out. It was a bonkers idea. And I think that the scientists next week are going to agree with that. And that it certainly wasn't following the science, which is the mantra that some of the government are going to be running.
Hale and Walport both pointed out the importance of test, track, and isolate.
Yeah.
And I gather the importance of that and what a huge difference that can. I believe that's why South Korea did so well, because of their previous experience with infection. They had a good system in place, and I think we failed kind of miserably on that. Yeah,
I mean, the point that we made in Module 1 was that this was learning which was there to be had. It wasn't something theoretical. It had been done. It had been done, as you say, in South Korea, but it had been done elsewhere. And I think what people looking back now, experts are saying, is that if you have a really quick test, trace, and isolate system, then you've got a very good chance of either stopping or massively slowing the infection rate. And then you don't need such stringent suite of other non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, to follow on from it. And the countries where you've got a much lower fatality rate per head of population, you can draw a line across from test, trace, and isolate to that outcome. And that's very much something that we're going to be pushing hard in terms of recommendations. And so, regrettably, when there is another pandemic, we hope that those measures put in place. But I think, just lastly on this point, it's pretty alarming that there doesn't appear to be measures taken even now to put our countries in a better place next time, which is pretty alarming. But we'll see.
I agree. I mean, everything is, the recommendations are there to be taken up. I mean, this is what Barb, I don't know if you agree. I know we agree. This is what we talk about. It's like they're there to be taken up now, but they don't have to wait for Baroness Hallett. Plenty of great stuff.
They were there before the pandemic, and they weren't heeded, and now they're once again there to be heeded now.
I wonder, Mary Claire, I wonder if the other point that kind of came out this week was about data sharing. And I just thought it almost seems an unsolvable problem. The Diamond and some of the other witnesses were saying we must have data sharing for the public interest. And yet they also understand that the owners of data are not so keen to share. Plus there are privacy issues. I mean, is it like unsolvable?
Well, in terms of, it was Freeguard's evidence touched on some of the data sharing elements as well. And obviously for the clients that I represent, we're leaning into, well, are you data sharing with Northern Ireland? You know, why are we getting this information? And you're absolutely right in terms of your observations regarding data sharing, because it seems to be an issue regarding ownership and, excuse me, an issue regarding ownership and what they can do with that. And certainly Freeguard's evidence made it clear that, you know, the government was very slow to share data, and that it would have been very helpful if the regions, and he talks about regions and not necessarily the devolved administrations, but we take it we're within that group, it would have been useful to them. And he talked about a crest going through regarding mobility, and you know, the impact in different regions, and it wasn't just London centric. There was issues in Leicester, there were issues in Manchester, and you know, freedom of that sharing of that information would have been very helpful to the various regions as to what their reaction could be in terms of protecting their people from the pandemic at the time. I think as well, one of the other things that that arose from the evidence this week that I think would be quite remiss not to touch upon was the lack of strategy was another key theme. Sir Gus O'Donnell's evidence really hit hard on that. Now, he was an interesting witness because he is a former cabinet secretary. So he's given evidence, not being in the room, not being the man behind the curtain. But what he does say is he's saying, you know, you have COBRA meetings, but COBRA is not the right way of dealing with it because it's a short, sharp, quick response. You know, was there another plan when you're asking the SAGE advisors to provide you with information? Do they know the reasons for that? Are they looking at the holistic reasons why you want to information regarding, for example, I think he uses the example of opening schools, etc. And so it was a matter of not just asking closed questions to the people who are advising you, explaining to them the reasons for the advice. And I think certainly some of the evidence that we heard today, there was certainly a friction of, well, our information was shared, it was open to the public, that was freely available, but then sometimes the government didn't follow that. And that goes back to following the science. And there was that disconnect between what the scientists advised that was freely available and what the government was doing, and nobody was explaining how you bridge that gap. And so that was another key theme from this week's evidence. And as I say, you know, it all underpins as we move on eventually to the politicians where that's going to take us. If their landing point and their opening argument is going to be follow the science, well, can we necessarily say that?
Well, he said, Gus O'Donnell said, I think quite specifically, he said if government is blaming science by saying that we follow the science, that is wrong. And he felt that the scientific evidence was more there for reassurance, I think he said. Exactly. So as Pete said earlier, it's true that probably will be where the government lands, right?
I anticipate that's where they would like to put their markers, because that was the key theme. And obviously to draw away from that, when that was something that during the critical period was drummed into us, that regardless of whatever else, we're following the science. That's the reason why we're doing this. This is why you should have faith in our decision making. And when it comes to it, I wonder exactly how much science was actually followed.
I agree. I wonder if I could ask Barb. Barb, what stood out for you this week so far? I mean, I know for practical reasons, we've had to record this podcast before that. We've had a lot of long COVID evidence, and maybe we'll touch on that next week because I think that will be interesting. But so far this week, Barb, what has been your standout moment?
I think for me was Professor Ailsa Henderson. She explained really, really well the devolved relationships with Westminster, which broke down horribly. Her knowledge was phenomenal. She explained funding, how it was funded into, even though Wales is devolved nations' health systems devolved from Westminster, she explained how the funding changes due to a certain formula that's set out. So I was really impressed with her. I wish I had seen her document that she'd supplied earlier. I was unaware of its existence, and I wish I had actually seen that to have read that so I could have input into that. But I sat there quite very impressed with what she was saying, and I think she summed it up a lot. So actually, you know, I said before, 2B is a bit of a non-event as far as I'm concerned after she spoke, because she was very clear on the relationship between the devolved nations and Westminster.
Thank you. Nicola, can I ask you, busy week for you, what were some of your standouts? What did your big takeaways from this week?
I think for me, this week has been a real mix of incredibly dry scientific factual evidence, but there's been some incredibly powerful evidence that I hope doesn't get lost. You mentioned before about women having to give birth alone whilst people were able to eat out to help out. That just seems barbaric, to keep a woman alone when she's at her arguably most vulnerable. Sticking with that subject, women's vulnerabilities, that when people were locked down, many women were locked up with their abusers, and every place that she might have been able to go to was completely removed. And the evidence from the women's organisations was very powerful on how they did their utmost to still provide some area of respite. But when a woman wasn't able to leave her home to make a phone call, that became very, very difficult. So that was incredibly difficult to hear too. Again, disabled women twice as likely to be the victim of sexual assault. That is a statistic that I hadn't heard before. And that really was quite shocking and terrible, which again just underlines the need for the structural inequalities evidence to be heard as part of this inquiry.
I think the witness for LGBTQ plus evidence, that witness, she gave similar shocking, kind of surprising figures about domestic violence. And you're right, it was a really hard listen.
Definitely hard.
Well, guys, I think we've covered everything. Unless, does anyone else have anything?
Mr. Weatherby.
Oh, Mr. Weatherby, of course.
One more point from me. On Wednesday morning, we had Professor Canter, who was the chair of the SAGE subgroup on ethnicity. And he was quite interesting, but the really key point for me was that SAGE didn't have an ethnicity subgroup until the end of August of 2020. So SAGE, the Scientific Advice to Government in Emergencies, a main pop-up government scientific advice group, had no race or ethnicity dedicated advice until very late. And I thought that was a really important point, and one which going forward again is something that needs to be taken very seriously.
I found his evidence interesting when he said, I think the first 10 doctors to die of COVID in the UK were from ethnic minorities, and he found that. And when he said that, I just remember thinking that I'm just so glad, because I know it was Broudie, Jackson, Canter. I know it was our lawyers who pushed for this inequalities evidence, and it was just, I'm so glad. And I mean, because it is so important.
The evidence that came out was that he and others had identified the obvious points. The first doctors, and unfortunately many more doctors followed them, were all or predominantly Black doctors who died. And he said that he kind of triggered the process, which led to SAGE, first of all, considering ethnicity and racial disproportionalities in outcomes. And that led to the subgroup. But the reality is that structural racism is so well recognized that it should have been thought of as a possibility well before a pandemic ever struck. So the advice mechanism should have been there right from the off, because it should have been presumed that there may well be disproportionalities or disparities of outcomes on the basis of race discrimination, structural discrimination, or indeed the other forms of discrimination that you've just been talking to the others about.
Yes, you're 100% right. I agree with you. And I'm just so grateful to you and to everyone else there for coming and talking to us. I know how much it means to the members of our group to have these things explained in a way that is more understandable. So thank you very much. And I'll see you all next week.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.